Chapter 10 of Joaquin, the Claude Duval of California. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Samson Speaks. Joaquin, the Claude Duval of California, or The Marauder of the Mines, a romance founded on truth, by Henry L. Williams. Chapter 10. Glittering Bait, Ambush at St. Andreas, Cardoza is quits with Marquita, Dr. Jack and the Sick Man, How Two of the Gallows Birds Went to Roost. One day was all that was required by the escaped highwayman to overtake his comrades, whom he found at table in a Chicago frame house called a tavern, half a dozen miles out of the town, named after the Commodore of so much service to the State of the Union. He acquainted them in a few words what he had been doing, and on that all jumped into saddle again. Another hour sufficed to bring them to the end of their journey. On the following day, just after sundown, Joaquin, Valenzuela, and the three-fingered miscreant, as they strolled along the levee, suddenly had their gaze attracted by three American miners who were making that immense display which has vulgarly received the title of splurge. They were dressed in new suits of dark green, of which they had replaced the buttons by good-sized pepites or pieces of scale gold. One wore on his breast, like a European order, a prong of a sluice fork, the whole tine of which was heavily gilt. Another was similarly decorated with a cradle spoon, covered as well with the precious ore. The third, except his glazed cap, had a nice little lump of some $50 or $60 worth of metal over its peak, was unlike the others as to carry trophies of the trade. They strutted with an air which proved that they were out merely to exhibit themselves. "A pretty set," remarked the chief. "They seem to be a least bit vain." "I should say so," said Valenzuela. "And if it is founded on a solid base, they ought to be owners of a little of the ore." "I was just thinking the same," chimed in Garcia, instinctively feeling for his knife. "They'll have to have a 6-inch steel shaft sunk into 'em." As he concluded his threat, the three cynosures stalked into an eating-house. Joaquin, ordering his followers to await his return, no sooner saw them disappear than he darted after them. He entered the saloon and sat down at a table not far from the Americans. In less than 10 minutes, while trifling with a cup of queer decoction dignified by the name of coffee, and charged just as much for, he gathered all the information of which he stood in need. Rejoining his satellites, he turned back with them on the way to the house in which they had temporarily installed themselves in the Mexican quarter of town, and as soon as the horses were baited, off to San Andreas. When 4 miles from Stockton, they pulled up, hid the horses in the chaparral, and themselves in the brush near the roadside. "Our men will be here very soon," remarked the captain. "On the eve of taking the back trail to their native land with the fortune which they boast of having amassed here, they talk of starting for San Francisco to-morrow. Another ought to have joined them at Stockton, and at 3 o'clock to-day, but as he hadn't turned up, they are returning to San Andreas to find him." "A regular windfall for us," said Valenzuela. "It oils the wheel for our idea." "Hark, I think I hear them," growled Three-Fingered Jack, as he thrust his head through the bushes. "Indeed, here they come," agreed Joaquin. "Wait till they're fairly abreast of us, and then, boys, upset the caballeros." The three miners at a gentle gallop were approaching. They could be heard dilating openly on the prospect of the old scenes again, and their sure thing on marriages and so forth. How they were going to make the money fly, how they would stand treat for years at Eastern Village taverns, how they would buy a house for this friend of theirs, how they'd half kill some enemy and buy off justice. They chatted of their luck at the placers, and laughed to think of the envy felt by their fellow workmen at their sudden departure. And they so sang, so laughed, and told such joyous stories that it proved that no foreboding was putting them on the alert against the ambuscade of evil. Hardly had they come up to the place where lay the banditti in wait than the latter, springing up from the concealment like partridges on a rise from the tall grass, grasped the reins of the horses, and before the unfortunate miners had time to overcome the surprise, a volley at point blank blew out their brains and emptied their saddles. The corpses were carefully stripped and dragged off into a thicket. Altogether, the three yielded nearly $8,000 in gold, dust, and grain. This profitable waylaying over, the chief and Jack Three Fingers started off in search of a new refuge, while Valenzuela returned toward Stockton to escort the two women and Cardoza. That same evening, the whole party came together once more on the way into El Dorado County. They crossed part of the Sacramento County and encamped on the South Fork of American River. In a few days, they were joined by Hernando Fontes and his cluster of rogue grapes, one of the number of which, while scouting among the fringe of tules, had espied the leader and his followers and hastened to inform his superior. Fontes had been charged with collecting all the horses he could run off, and from different districts he had already driven close upon 400 to the main rendezvous. He told Joaquin that Antonio and Guerra had returned from Sonora to the Arroyo, each bringing a new mistress. The captain was well satisfied with the intelligence. For an instant, he was on the point of departing with all of his gang to the headquarters, so impatient was he to learn the details of his lieutenant's enterprise and to see the new señoritas, but private affairs of much higher importance decided him to defer for some time the pleasure he proposed to himself. Profiting, however, by the occasion presenting itself, he made Clarina and Marquita go to Arroyo, entrusting them to the guard of Cardoza, Fernando, and of a couple of other Mexicans. In this way, he gave them rest from their fatigues, at the same time that he shielded them from the perils to which he and his might yet be exposed before they too could reach the asylum. The two young women had hardly left the camp with their guard than a dispute arose among Marquita and her lover. The former asserted very plainly that the latter was not to be compared to her preceding flame, Gonzales, as regarded affection for her, and declared that she would not have anything to do with him thereafter. Cardoza, finding that he suffered shameful defeat in a war of words with her, cut a dainty little switch from the hedge and used it up, bark, inner peel, wood and pithe, to a few inches upon the rebel's shoulders. The latter submitted to all appearance with resignation most full and humble, but she was really revolving plans of revenge. On the following day, as they both were ascending slowly a pathway which wound among the peaks and crags of a very steep sierra, the vindictive Marquita seized the opportunity, when they were on the brink of a precipice more than 125 feet deep, and plucking her tiny but sharp dagger from her bosom, buried its needle-like blade over her lover's shoulder in his heart. Cardoza uttered a low moan and tried to turn around, but as he attempted this, his horse reared, slipped, and toppled over. Down they went, rider and steed, to the bottom. Marquita had so dexterously and quickly executed her project that nobody at all had been witness of it. By the time the rest came up, she had restored the weapon to its place. She went so far even as to pour out a profusion of tears, very bitter, seemingly, over the loss. It may be that they were the work of remorse, but in any event her grief was not of long duration. The trysting place had been no sooner attained than her gaiety returning. The merry murderess had accepted as third gallant a young fellow named Manuel Savalio. 2 days afterward, Joaquin heard of the accident that was said to have befallen one of his command, Fernando having dispatched one of his men to carry the tidings, and thought it strange that so good a cavalier had had this happen to him. It seemed impossible that any failure on his part had led to the catastrophe. With a dozen of his bandits, he went with them to the place to ferret out the facts and to bury the victim. They used a different road to that taken by the former party, and descended to where lay the cavalier and his horse. The corpse was closely examined, but it had been so cut by the points of rocks below that the puncture of the poniard was perfectly past perception. After having carefully removed all the arms and valuables upon the body, the robbers tumbled it into a hole in the sand and left him alone in his homicidal and felonious glory. At the end of another week, Joaquin, accompanied by Three-Fingered Jack, Valenzuela, and Fernando's troop, in all 26, proved rascals, took to the road to recommence depredations in El Dorado County, as well as in the neighboring one of Calaveras. On coming near Mud Springs, an isolated hut on the hillside drew their gaze to it. Believing it to be unoccupied and seeing at first glance that it was an excellent place in which to spend the night, Jack clapped spurs to his horse, rushed up the plain, jumped off in front of the hut, and throwing open the door, walked in unceremoniously. Contrary to the idea that had sprung up, the dwelling was occupied. The tenant was a foreigner who was kept to his bed by some serious ailment, and thus gave to the surroundings all that appearance of abandonment and loneliness which had deceived the gentleman of the highway. "Hello, sick man!" exclaimed Jack, seeing the couched person move. "Pour l'amour de love of God, a duck," murmured the low, weak voice most supplicatingly. "I'm a doctor," replied Jack, disengaging his knife. "Kill or cure is my motto," and he drew his steel across the sick man's wasted yellow throat. 2 or 3 of his comrades lent a hand, and they carried the body outside and tossed it into a near-at-hand ravine. Thereupon the gang took possession of the hovel, which they found to be not poorly supplied with all kinds of provisions, blankets, mining implements, pipes, and of course a fair stock of the Virginian weed. Operations were commenced on the latter by making up a lot of it into cigarettes, which kept them smoking for a couple of hours. Then they spread out their blankets, wrapped themselves up, and dropped off quietly into slumber. As the aurora, with her sunny pencil, began laying the colors on the early sky, the commanding bandit set off 3 men to the Mud Springs camp to procure coffee and butter, and whatever else was required by the dainty appetites of his freebooters. In about 2 hours, one of them came back, not only alone but empty-handed. "Where are the rest of you?" inquired the chief. "Dead," answered the men. "Dead how?" The returned one drew his finger around his neck and then lifted himself by the ear. "Hanged, asked all?" "Hung like beef. Yes, captain and comrades mine. Hardly had we set foot in the cursed settlement, and had the 2 went into grocery to buy, while I stopped at a bar for my eye-opener, talking to the owner of the Pasade, who was a Mexican, then I heard a hell of a row outside. I looked. 4 or 5 Yankees had hold of my mates, covering them with bowies and 6-shooters. One, with a dreadful loud lungs, was shouting that he recognized Sebastiano El Carpintero for a horse thief who had even run off not a few head from his own ranche in Sacramento Valley in 1850, and after being trapped had broken prison. And he went on to cry in that same loud voice that his partner must be one of the same tribe, or else he wouldn't be along with them. "Just as if that proved anything," remarked the bandit. "Why, I've been with honest men often, and I—" "Never was mistaken for one," said Garcia. "Just so. However, there was no getting the best of the crowd that the noisy brute scared up. While they hauled up my mates to an ugly tree, I slipped through the back window of the bar and quit." "A confoundedly provoking story," said Joaquin. "We must leave this forthwith. If it weren't for the fact that I want to do something more important with my men, we would go down into the springs and lay waste the whole paltry camp. But the Yankees may hold their horses. They shan't lose anything by not getting their dose right away. To horse, boys, and away." In a trice, the pirates of the placers were mounted and pushing their horses on at such a pace as the Pony Express man may take when the redskins are after the mail. At first, good care was taken not to describe a straight line. By zigzags and detours they moved, and after making many stoppages at various places, sometimes to despoil a traveler, and at others to bait the steeds, the band drew rein on an eminence of sad and gloomy aspect, about a mile from Salmon Falls. There they passed the night. The spot seemed to have been formed expressly by nature for use to which they put it. Almost entirely concealed by the rocks all around, the wall having its gaps and chinks filled up thickly with inextricable woven briars, was a central clearing of 20 feet or so in diameter, which was the most comfortable and safe of all robbers' retreats. End of chapter 10.